I'm Laura Cox Kaplan. This is She Said, She Said. Betsy Fischer Martin is an Emmy-winning television executive and producer. Currently, she is the executive director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University. The first 23 years of Betsy's career were spent at NBC, including as executive producer for top-rated Sunday public affairs show Meet the Press. Betsy also co-created and co-hosted Bloomberg Politics Masters in Politics podcast, and she founded her own consulting business where she helps corporate executives to increase their comfort in interactions with the media. We'll talk to Betsy about what she learned from her longtime friend and mentor, Tim Russert. Tim, as many of you may recall, was a legend in television journalism and in Washington as the former host of Meet the Press. We'll also talk to Betsy about career transition. She made an interesting one when she left NBC. All of that and much, much more. Betsy, welcome to She Said, She Said.
I'm so glad to be with you.
Well, I'm so happy to have you. We have lots to discuss, but let's start with talking about your current full-time gig, even though I know you've got some side hustles, and we'll talk about those. But you are the executive director of the Women in Politics Institute at AU. Talk about what that is and how you're evolving this, because it's something that's been around for a while.
Absolutely. It's a terrific institute at American University in their School of Public Affairs. And what we focus on really is the academic training and the practical training that we give to young women so that we can eventually, our hope is to close that gender gap in politics. So we feel like between training and academic insights that we can give our students, we can help further that along. And so really that is what we try to do, and we try to highlight the opportunities and the challenges that women faced in the political arena.
Yeah, so you have adjunct professors.
We have we are very thankful to have you on our team for sure. Yeah, and so we have adjunct professors, we have full-time professors. We do a lot of research. We have one of my favorite components of the institute is that we actually run a leadership training program called We Lead, which is for young women ages 22 to 30 who want to run for office themselves one day. And they're postgraduates. They're all working full-time on the Hill or in advocacy organizations, nonprofits. And a cohort of 35 of them spend a full academic year with us one full Saturday a month. We have those sessions and we sort of do soup to nuts campaign training with them. We'll spend an entire session on fundraising or a session on communications or elements of a campaign. And they hear from experts, practitioners in the field that can help them think about how they can best position themselves. And we also have a professional development consultant that comes in and works with them also in terms of how to shape their biography, how to be better at networking, some of those practical professional skills that you need even if you aren't running for office. So I think it's beneficial as well. So that's one of my favorite programs, and we have that cohort of 35 very, very impressive young women.
Are you able to track the young women that are going through the program, and do you have a sense of what's happening to them?
Yeah, we actually have a very robust alum group, if you will, within the program, and we tap into those alums a lot to come back years later and actually help be on panels and facilitate discussions. And in fact, Lauren Underwood, who just won in Illinois, youngest female African-American young woman to be in Congress, is one of our alums. We're
wonderful.
Super proud of that. She graduated from the program in 2012 and is now a member of Congress. So we're excited this year she's going to come back for our little graduation that we do and be our keynote speaker. And I know that young women will be thrilled to hear from her.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. So your role at AU represented a pretty significant career shift for you. You spent 20 plus years at NBC.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about making that transition, like why this? What was it about this particular role that was appealing to you?
It sounds different in a certain respect, going from political journalism into teaching, but in a lot of respects, it is similar because I view what I'm doing at the Institute and then the courses that I teach at American University very similar in the sense of when I was with NBC and running Meet the Press for all those years with Tim Russert, we really thought of our mission, if you will, is to educate the public and to educate our viewers about politics. And so in that sense, it's very similar because I feel like I'm doing the same thing, just not broadcasting to 6 million people every week, but really on a one-on-one basis and with students in the classroom. So I think that there's some overlap in kind of thinking about that mission.
Yeah. Was it hard to make the shift? I mean, spending even 10 years in an organization and pivoting to something else can be really daunting. What was your thought process? When did you know it was time to leave?
Well, it's interesting because I sort of grew up at Meet the Press. I did my undergrad at American University. One of the wonderful things about American University in Washington, D.C. is that the students there are very politically engaged, doing a number of different internships. And so I had done an internship on the Hill. I had done an internship at a law firm, and I was planning to go to law school. And I came across in the Career Center binder, there was no fancy app at this point, literally flipping through a binder of a potential internship literally down the street on Nebraska Avenue at NBC News at Meet the Press. And I thought, I think I've heard of that show, and that could be sort of interesting. It's politics. I can walk there. I don't have to take that darn shuttle to the metro. I can sleep a little bit later. I mean, what else does a college student need for incentive there? And so I applied and was hired as the intern and literally started that same semester as that Tim Russert took over the show as the moderator. Wow. It was Garrick Utley at the and then Tim took over in that December as the moderator, and I was fortunate enough to be able to stay and for the next semester as well. And this was during the 91-92 campaign cycle. I'm dating myself here. And just being involved in covering that campaign was fascinating to me. I had grown up in New Orleans and politics is sport down there in Louisiana. And so now I was in the center of it here. And I just got bitten by the journalism bug. And it was very similar, I found, to what I was trying to think about doing with my life going to law school in terms of really looking at the debate of something, figuring out why you think this or that. And I realized while I love politics, I didn't find myself to be a very political person. I love the study of it. Mm-hmm. I love the debate of it. I love the, kind of getting behind, talking to voters, understanding issues, thinking about things from the other side. And so that actually fit perfectly with this career in political journalism. Tim Russert, who had gone to law school, said to me after my internship, "Oh, you don't need to go to law school. Forget about that. Stay and help us, cover the campaign." And at that point, the political unit and Meet the Press were one and the same. And so I deferred my admission to law school. I was supposed to go to Tulane, back home in New Orleans, where I'm from, and wrote them a very nice letter. Said I would, been given the opportunity to cover this campaign, and would they please defer my admission? And they said, of course, and they kept my $700, which they still have. I tease them about that every time I talk to them. I say, "You guys still have my $700." Anyway, and so I never went to law school, but I did stay and got to go to the convention that summer in New York, and that was thrilling, and really just got bitten by the journalism bug. And Tim Russert was so much a part of that because he just exuded that enthusiasm about politics. And it was a great experience. And so I went back again to AU and got my master's part-time on the weekend. They had a weekend program because I had not taken one single journalism course at school at all. It was just not in my master plan. And I was able to there kind of really learn some practical components of journalism, editing tape and, things along that nature. And so at the time at NBC, it was sort of a sink or swim environment. And so I was able to kind of get those skills and move up through the ranks and do some unique things. And at that point, what I always tell people about job security is my job at Meet the Press at the time was the researcher. And this was pre-Google. Yeah. Again, to date myself, I was the Google. And so that was a very good thing to be, because you are well needed and, you're a resource. And so a show like Meet the Press that was so built around research and finding facts and information, when you're the keeper of those files, right, you have some pretty good job security. And so I was able to stay there and then move up the ranks, and then became the executive producer about 10 years later, and then stayed for another 11 years. So yeah, a total of 22, 23 years, which means 23 years with no weekends too, by the way.
Right, because your production schedule,
it's pretty much 24/7. I mean, you would theoretically have a Monday or Tuesday off, but in the world of, news changing and having to be on top of things, that was very rare to just completely unplug. So it was a lot. And, I felt like by the time I left, I had sort of done everything that I wanted to do. And the news world was very different. What I really enjoyed about Meet the Press was, again, going back to the research component of it, I loved having a good 3 or 4 days to dive into a potential guest or a topic. And this is what, Tim and I would do, for several days in a row, is doing this research, figuring out the graphics, the tape that we put into the show, and being able to, have a 25 or 30 minute, segment and really go deep into something. And that's what I really enjoyed about it. And, I think now, if you look at, the Sunday shows and lots of different shows, right, it's very difficult in this 24/7 news environment where news just, is lightning speed, to be able to figure out the show that you want to do on a Sunday. It's very difficult on a Tuesday to start planning for that. Back in my Stone Age, we would, literally book the show on like a Tuesday or Wednesday and feel fairly confident that the show that we were going to put on Sunday would still be extremely relevant, and that we would be taking a story and moving it forward. And these days, it's very difficult, I think, the way things change at lightning speed, very difficult for shows to do that. I mean, they're probably not making final decisions on the top guest in the show until like a Friday afternoon. Mm-hmm. And that does not give you 3 or 4 days to do the research that you need to do to have a, 25-minute conversation.
Does the public suffer from that?
The early days of what we did on Meet the Press, it was less partisan in the sense that we would routinely, for example, have, the majority leader and minority leader of the Senate, Dole and Mitchell, coming on Meet the Press, almost to the fact that it was like, almost too much, but almost every other month they would, it seems, come on Meet the Press together and talk about issues, talk about legislation, not a debate, but a civilized discussion. And I think that was very important for people to see and for people to learn about issues in a constructive way. Mm-hmm. And then, Lott and Daschle certainly came on Meet the Press many, many times. I mean, I first met you back in those days when you were working for Senator Shelby, and we would routinely have a D and an R come on the show together. And first of all, you haven't seen the Senate majority leader and minority leader on a show together in probably 10 years. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't happen. And it's too bad, because I think the public can definitely learn from that. And when you do see an R&D on together, it's more of a battle. It's more of a debate, and things get, screaming over each other back and forth. And I don't think that's very productive.
Yeah. So because you teach journalism to students at AU, how do you think about there's been such an evolution, certainly in the ways that you've just talked about, but also particularly as it relates to social media and the competition that exists for mainstream media that wasn't there before, where they really are competing for eyeballs, for advertising, for all of these sort of historic metrics, right? How has that changed, and how are your students sort of reacting to that change?
It's interesting. This semester I'm teaching a course in the School of Public Affairs on politics in the television age, and so we're looking at how television, the power of television, how it's influenced politics over the years, and
sort of starting with Nixon.
Starting with that, absolutely, or even starting with that, and then moving forward. And of course, toward the end of the semester, we're going to definitely get into more of how the internet has kind of revolutionized politics. But, even, for example, last week I had Steve McMahon, Democratic media consultant, come on and talk about TV advertising. And, that was one of the things certainly that we talked about, was how advertising campaigns now, it's much more digital, and how does that influence things. But the resources that even just the internet, never mind social media, provide now, there's so much information. I remember back in the day, again, pre-Google and whatnot, you'd be trying to find information. I would spend my week as a researcher finding information that was going on. On Sunday mornings, I would come in and, if we were having, the senator on from Illinois, I would be calling the Chicago affiliate and saying, hey, what's in the Chicago Tribune this morning? Anything about the senator? If so, please fax.
But it was more direct contact.
It was more direct contact, but it was also finding information. Now, it was so much information that really journalism is much more about distilling that information for the public and trying to pick out what do you need to know, what's the most important, as opposed to more gathering that I felt like we had to do because there's just so much out there, which is great.
Right.
But, I think that certainly social media has changed the pace so much of news. And, I think anybody can realize, what we're talking about today, 2 days from now, will be something probably totally different.
Yeah.
Whereas a story really kind of stuck around in the past there's just so much now for people to grab onto,
It's fair to say that Tim Russert was a mentor to you. You worked with him for many, many years. And you wrote a fabulous piece with one of your former NBC colleagues about some of the things that you learned about him and how it transformed the way that you think about your work and your life. Talk a little bit about that, because I think it's a fabulous piece. We'll post it in the show notes.
Thank you. So my colleague, Erin Fogarty Owen, and I had, I smile when I think about it because we had so many fun years together with Tim working kind of in the trenches. But I had 17 years working with Tim, just from that very first beginning of that internship. So he was just a larger than life figure, and that enthusiasm that I mentioned earlier about politics was so contagious. He was like a kid in a candy store, if there was a new poll out that morning, it was like so exciting. But he really taught us a lot in terms of, the values of journalism, the ethics involved in it, the key to preparing for things. I mean, he just, never would go on the set and wing any kind of thing. Everything was really thought out and planned. And he had that legal background. And so, we would really plot those questions back and forth, almost like a cross-examination. And so he taught us the importance of that and thinking creatively about things. And then, on a personal level, he was someone that, family to him was very important, and his young son at the time, Luke. And so, Erin and I both were, young women, pre-kids during some of that time. And we had a great role model in him in terms of like how to set your priorities in life and what's really important. And to him, that was his son. And so I think as Erin and I are both now parents, and, Tim was after me for many years, when are you going to have a baby? When are you going to have a baby? And so I had my...
you did.
I did, yes, I did. In 2001, I had my daughter, and he always called her Baby E because I didn't know if she was going to be a boy or a girl, and I had E names for each, and so he always referred to her as Baby E, even after she was born. But, he was so excited, and I never will forget, a message that he sent to me. This was our top screen messages, the equivalent of email now, and he said, this is the most important job you'll ever have. And that was just so true. And he said, nothing else matters. And I was very blessed in that environment. And and then my daughter was born. Actually, she was born September 16th. 2001, so the week after 9/11.
Oh, wow.
And so I was in the hospital before she was born on bed rest, and Tim would come in routinely, every day and bring some sort of pizza or, hamburgers or some sort of horrible food to supplement the equally horrible food in the hospital. And, all the nurses would be swooning, oh, Tim Russert's here. I got extra special treatment, which was terrific. And then, 9/11 happened. And I remember being, in the hospital with my dial-up laptop, on my belly and, working and figure out what we were going to do on the show. And we ended up having Dick Cheney that Sunday in a historic interview that we did from Camp David, which, of course, I was not there, but my colleague Erin held down the fort. We had that really momentous first live interview ever from Camp David that Sunday.
I remember you talk about, I think in the piece, having to make a call on the fly because you couldn't disclose where the interview
yes,
was
and this was part of,
he was in an undisclosed location.
This was part of the creativity. And so, Mary Madeline at the time, who was working for the vice president, said, Jim, you can't say you're at Camp David, and security is worried about that. And he said, well, how about we say we're in the shadows of Camp David? She's like, I think that'll work. And so that's what we did. It worked.
So Tim was also famous for, as you've just talked about, having a very personal approach to the people that he worked with, but also the people that he interviewed and people that he would come in contact with, and that he was famous for the little notes that he would send to
just
people.
Little, 2-sentence notes on a piece of notepaper. There was no fancy personalized, crane stationery for him. And he just, he would send these all over. Anytime a guest was on, we would take a photograph of the guest, and when the photos came back printed, he would send a little handwritten note to the people. The key to his success was these relationships that he was able to form with people in terms of sources as well. And he, felt just as comfortable talking, to a Capitol police officer as a source and getting information as he did talking to, the Senate Majority Leader. And it was sort of equal treatment for both. And he was kind of that everyday, this was from his roots growing up in Buffalo and in a working class family. And, he always talked as well about he would find his dad after the show, Big Russ, be his chiefest, most accurate focus group. He would literally call him after each show and get his dad's thoughts on how the show was, and whether the senator was lying, or was he not coming across truthful, or was Tim too tough, or whatever it was. And he really appreciated and valued sort of that everyday feedback that he would get from people, not sort of the the elite Washington crowd. And I think he was able to ask questions on the show that sort of the everyday person wanted to find an answer to. And I think he was able to ask those questions that wouldn't go above people's heads. He would explain something. He didn't talk in Washington acronyms all the time, even though he was schooled in politics and had spent so many years as an operative in politics, working for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the Senate, and also working for Governor Mario Cuomo in New York. And so he had these sources everywhere. And, he came into NBC at the time, and there's been a lot of discussion recently about people in that revolving door. And so some people say, well, Tim Russert did it. He came in to be sort of the right-hand man, if you will, to the then president of NBC News, sort of an advisor, fixer type. And this was back in, the late 80s. And he, for example, wired this interview this famous interview that the Today Show got with the Pope. And so that had Tim's fingerprints on it, and he had somehow wired that. And then he did that for a couple years and was just an advisor on how to cover things and, I guess relationship building. And then the Washington Bureau job came open, and he was sent down to be the manager, so the Washington Bureau chief in Washington. And did that for a couple years. And part of that job, every morning we had a call at NBC of all the, bureau chiefs and executive producers of all the shows. And it's kind of a download on what's going on that day, sort of like your front page meeting at a newspaper. It's sort of the main editorial meeting. And Tim's responsibility as Washington bureau chief was to give kind of the Washington debrief on what's happening in politics. And he would do such a good job at that and put his finger exactly on, the key components of something that the suits in New York, the bosses were like, yeah, I think we need to put this on TV, actually. This is sounding pretty good, right? And so he started doing, the Today Show at the time had a political panel, and he would go on and sort of be early day analysis pundit type on this political panel. And that's how he started even going on television. And then from there, he would be, Meet the Press format at the time was we would have a panel of journalists questioning the guest, hence the name Meet the Press. And so it was a panel of rotating journalists that would question the guest. And so Tim very often then became one of the rotating questioners when Garrett Utley was the moderator. And then Garrett Utley moved back to New York to do the Sunday Today Show. which at the time was filmed in Washington. Anyway, they moved that back to New York, and then they had Tim take over as the moderator. But it was very much an accidental career for him because he always said he had a face for radio. But he had sort of that everyday look about him.
Very relatable.
You know, he's sitting there in his Land's End suits. He didn't want hairspray a mile from him. I mean, just the opposite of that sort of central casting anchorman look you have, right? That was not him.
And people liked him.
People liked him, and he was connectable. And he had, like I said, that enthusiasm that just gravitated people, pulled people in.
Yeah. So as you think about this incredible experience that you had for much of your career, and you think about all of this great advice and interesting ways of working and relating to people, which piece or two do you sort of find yourself gravitating to as you think about the impact that he had on your career?
That's a good question. There's so much of it that I find is so relevant. I mean, hardly a week goes by where I don't think of some aspect of, things that we kind of learned around. But I think at Tim's core, he was very focused on kind of doing the right thing and presenting things in a fair way. And I just think he had sort of that internal compass when it came to his job in terms of making sure issues were presented on both sides. And, part of what I do at the Institute that I also, think is important, and you and I have talked about this, is I want to be a place that, we are nonpartisan and that we kind of examine issues from both sides, have experts on both sides. And so, while Tim did come from Democratic politics, and this is ironic in this day and age when I feel like so many people on TV, it's very obvious where they come from a opinion standpoint, but he just went out of his way on so every week to really have both sides of an issue. And I never, in all those 17 years of working with him, never had a politically bent conversation with him where he vocalized his political opinion on something.
Really?
Yeah. Never would he get off the show and, rail on. Now, he would get off the show and say, oh, that person's lying, or, oh my gosh, I can't believe he said that. But never arguing a side on a particular issue. And he just found that to be, and I think that's one of the terrific things about a program like Meet the Press, and it still is to this day, a place where both sides are treated fairly. And he would talk about sort of doing tough but fair questioning. And he always told the story about going to see Lawrence Spivak, who was one of the co-creators of the program, which, by the way, was created in 1947, the longest-running television program in the world.
Wow.
Before Lawrence Spivak passed away, Tim went to go see him after he took over as moderator and asked him what kind of the secret of success was. And he said, learn as much about your guest and take the other side, and do that consistently week in and week out. And that's the secret ingredient. And so he really kind of saw himself as somebody who really did need to be kind of nonpartisan and sort of have that equal opportunity questioning for folks.
You had a really, it's a horrible thing to happen. He passed away tragically. Mm-hmm. He died of a heart attack and had been editing video, as I recall.
Tracking video.
Mm-hmm.
Tracking an opening to the show.
You guys were getting ready to put the show together.
Yeah,
right?
It was a Friday.
And so this was just before Sunday. And this is somebody who you've worked for many, many years, who you're very close to, who's a mentor, who it's horrible anytime that happens, but when you're particularly close to someone and when it's in the work context, how did you deal with it?
As anything, right? You kind of get through it.
Yeah.
And it was particularly difficult because, as you mentioned, you're in a work environment with somebody and there's such a part of your life because so much of your life revolves around your profession, especially I feel like here in Washington, right? And so he was sort of definitely a mentor, because I had started working with him at such a young age, in those early days, very much of, a father figure, and then more like a brother as we sort of, as I sort of grew up. And so losing that was very, very difficult. And, it's the kind of thing, it just never is the same after that. Yeah. It just never is. But you have to be thankful for the time that I did have with him, that I'm grateful every day for it. And then, trying to pick up those pieces and move along. And, part of what we tried to do with the show in the sort of that immediate aftermath, because again, he passed away on a Friday, and then it's like, what are we going to do on a Sunday? And then your mind is, if you're running a TV show, has to go to, I got to put a show on the air. And so
What did you do?
we did a big tribute show to him. We put that together. We had a ton of video. We had a panel, Mary Madeline, Doris Kearns Goodwin, all the folks that knew him best. And I was actually on the panel also. And so then I was trying to be on the panel and produce the show at the same time, and then deal with everything that was going on. But, I look back on that and think, well, maybe that's how I got through it, right? Because I just stayed busy and tried to focus on putting on the best kind of tribute that we could to him. But, it definitely wasn't easy. Tom Brokaw, thankfully, stepped in and, was the interim moderator for a good 6 months or so, which I think was great. Like I said, definitely thankful for every minute of those 17 years. And just, it was, so unforeseen and such a tragic thing, and I just think he's just one of those irreplaceable people in the larger world of journalism that I don't think we'll see again.
Yeah, such a huge impact.
Yeah,
such a huge impact. It's interesting. Most of my mentors, as I was making my way up the chain were men.
Yeah.
Yours were primarily men. I'm sure you had some women mentors. But as we think about this next generation of young women who hopefully are listening to this podcast and thinking about mentorship, what's your advice for work, for seeking out male mentors as well as female mentors? Because I think there can be a lot of confusion around whether that's important and necessary and sort of what role they play. So what's your perspective on that?
I feel like mostly they choose you and you don't necessarily choose them in some respect. But, I was lucky because Meet the Press had actually a long history of having females running the show. And the woman who was the longtime producer with the show, Betty Dukert, was there when I first started and retired several years later. But she had actually been with the program by the time she retired, 40 years.
Oh, wow.
She started literally as the secretary.
So you were just getting started.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I had nothing on that. Literally started as the secretary to Lawrence Spivak and worked her way up. And she had a real sense, and I learned a lot from her because she was somebody that was always, never got rattled. You could never see her sweat. Always very graceful and appreciative to people and had really solid relationships around town. Never double-crossed anybody. Was not a revengeful person and just a really good person and, existed in kind of the rough and tumble world. And back then, of course, of being a woman even, and excelled and did so well and was such a driving force of the show. And so in her, I had all of those qualities and then I had all the qualities I mentioned earlier in Tim. So I really had the best of both worlds to model after. And in an industry that, did not have a lot of women leaders at the top.
Yeah.
And so I was lucky to have her and to have, of course, Tim. But I feel like with mentoring in general, it's a two-way street in a lot of respects too, right? There's a couple of young women that I've just through AU over the years, been teaching and developed, a relationship with them. And, it's a two-way street. I try to help them with things, but then they'll, call and see how I'm doing, or they'll come and speak to my class, and it's something that I think to be an effective mentee, you have to approach it in a way where it's a two-way street.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think that sometimes that's missed.
Yeah.
Because the person feels like, I'm so junior, how can I possibly offer something of value to this person who's very accomplished? But you can.
Oh, yeah.
You just said.
Yeah. Even, how are you? Yeah. Or happy birthday.
And their perspective.
Yeah,
right?
their insights. Exactly.
Yeah, so interesting. So you also have a consulting business, which is sort of a bit of a side hustle for you.
Yeah, I don't do a ton of it anymore, but in the interim before I was at AU full-time-ish here now, that I did start a media consulting business where primarily I work on training corporate executives, media training. And I really enjoyed that. And it was, again, an accidental kind of thing. People kept asking me to do it just because of my experience. And once I did it for a couple of folks, I said, I really like this. And I don't do political because I feel like that's too close to where I was. And my husband is also a political reporter, so I don't want to have any sort of conflicts that way. But I'm fascinated by the business culture, and I'm fascinated to kind of go into a company and be able to look under the hood with them and figure out, how the CEO or the executive team is presenting itself and ways to do that better.
Do you see a common challenge as it relates to those opportunities that you've had to sort of go in and look under the hood? Do you see commonalities or advice that you could consistently give that oftentimes is lacking?
I think that authenticity factor is something that's so important, that, again, going back to Tim and what he was able to do on Meet the Press, being authentic. I think as sometimes in CEO land, and you can appreciate this, there's too much of that kind of, corporate talk all the time and the jargon, and people zone out and people don't understand and listen. And so if a person can be connectable to investors, connectable to clients, connectable to customers, connectable to other employees, I just think that is a much more effective way to communicate, and to kind of get off of some of these, staged talking points that people rely on too much. Well, I think you need to have a message and you need to have pre-thought about that. I think you need to be able to kind of enhance messaging with talking about examples, illustrations, and so to make your point really resonate with folks. And what I found with the clients that I work with, they were all very receptive. I mean, there's a reason that they're hiring someone like me, and they want to do better and they want to learn. And again, it goes to teaching and learning. And then I just feel like that's kind of a theme of what I've been doing in my life, because I love to learn and I love to teach. And so if I can learn about a company and then kind of distill that in a way that, well, here's what resonates with me, and here's how maybe you can push that message out, that I think it's been very fun.
Yeah. I'm interested in your perspective, both from where you used to sit and now where you sit today, in thinking about political coverage of women in politics. And we've all heard, the obsession over clothes and hair and all of that business.
Yeah.
But what's your perspective? I mean, is there really a huge difference? Does that difference in focusing on appearance really matter that much? What do you think?
I think you can point to lots of different examples. And I think we have gotten better as a culture in kind of calling some of this out when we see it. But I do think, like, going to the likability issue, there certainly have been men that have been seen as unlikable or unrelatable, i.e. Mitt Romney, in that sense of not being able to relate to people. And that gets called, people made fun of his ironed, jeans being creased. Right. There is some of that that's kind of par for the course.
But that's unusual for men.
Yeah. And, women, I definitely think things have gotten better. And I think it's the sort of thing, if you see something, say something, that's important. And women and kind of media watchers in general have gotten better about, really kind of trying to be the umpire on some of the things, like, hey, this is going a little bit too far. But, the likability issue that's going on, for example, with Amy Klobuchar, are we over-reporting on that? Is that too sexist? I think with her, that has been certainly something that has followed her around for a while.
Right.
And it would be almost strange if that wasn't discussed in some way. Now, does the fact that people are saying that, are they treating her, are employees looking at her in a different way because she's a woman, like, i.e. actions that she did, do they perceive those more harshly or more inappropriately than they would as a male? That's not a media question. That's how she's being perceived by people that work for her.
It's hard to imagine that there would be a huge difference between genders as it relates to that question of throwing notebooks and telephones and belittling people or whatever. I mean, these are allegations. I went there. I don't know. But this is what's been reported, and it's hard for me to imagine if I had a male boss who threw a notebook at my head.
Right. That you wouldn't maybe raise your hand and say, and he's running for president, and say, hey, maybe we have a little temper problem here, right?
Yeah.
So in that particular case, I see it more legitimate in terms of this is an issue that should be talked about.
Right. This notion of nice is something that really your mentor Tim Russert really embodied. This notion of nice. Nice can be perceived as weak. And it can also sometimes, I think, be perceived as cutting both ways as it relates to women. If you're too nice, then you might be perceived as not being effective
competent
or competent.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's your perspective on this notion of nice?
Well, I think definitely it's something that women have to grapple with. I mean, I remember there's a famous quote from Jane Swift, who was the acting governor in Massachusetts, and her point was that if people think that I'm too nice, they don't think I'm competent enough. If they don't think I'm tough enough and competent enough, they think I'm a bitch, right? And so it's women political leaders. It's certainly something that is out there, and I feel like the more, and again, this goes back to the mission of, trying to close that gender gap, the more women we can have in political office and the more that we can see and model, and, all the research suggests that, it's one of the most important qualities in getting more women to run is having that modeling, being able to see women in office. And so I think as more women are run and hold political leadership, my hope is that that battle between nice and competent declines. And I think it has over the last couple of years.
Betsy, we ask each of our guests on the podcast to leave us with a single piece of advice, life hack, or a mantra, something that could be sort of a guiding light for you. One of those things, maybe something that you share with your students with some regularity. What would be yours?
What I do tell, students ask me a lot, how do I differentiate myself in the workplace, and how do I kind of move up? And, I think sometimes, you see this notion of young folks always kind of being in a hurry, right? To move up. What do I do?
Right.
Right. But I always say the most important thing, in that workplace to do is really try to anticipate what your supervisor or boss needs and be sort of that indispensable person. And of course, that means coming in early, leaving late, and, being an employee that can do things that you don't need to ask them to do based on the fact that you've asked them to do something before. Oh, they know you like it in a certain way, because, managers, supervisors are busy, and the time that it takes to stop and re-explain something to somebody is valuable time. And so I think as young people try to stand out in the workplace, those that I've always found that can anticipate what their supervisor is looking for and kind of produce that quality without being asked about it all the time is a real, it's an interesting way to think about it, and to, focus on trying to be productive and do so in a way that doesn't need a ton of oversight.
Yeah. That's great advice. Betsy, thank you so much.
Of course,
for being
it was my pleasure.
Oh, it was a delight to have you. I
you.
really
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it.
Thank
Betsy
you.
and I have known each other a long time.
Yeah.
Even I learned some things about you, which is a lot of fun. To learn more about Betsy, we will include show notes. You can find those on our website at www.shesaidshesaidpodcast.com. If you're enjoying the podcast, please be sure to leave us some feedback. We love hearing from you. And most importantly, thanks so much for listening.